Really uncomfortable about being recorded. If you feel really uncomfortable about being recorded, then now is the time to take your name off or leave. But very welcome to you all. We're going to talk, the panel are going to talk for about an hour, and then we're going to have about 30 minutes for a Q&A and open discussion. But you're most welcome to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. What happened to the Q&A? As we go along.
It's only chat for this one.
It's only chat.
So it's in the chat.
That's fine. We can manage with that. So essentially the background to this is that the ARC team, which was Abrehet, myself, and Felipe Evia, who's, I don't know if he's here actually, is he here? We reviewed literature on the role of civil society in national education policy for the Education Out Loud program. We were working as global learning partners for the Education Out Loud program, which is the largest civil society fund in the world to education, which is funded by Global Partnership for Education. And that literature review was very high and very necessarily high level and quite broad. We wanted a big picture take on what was known. And as I said, we drew quite heavily on the work of people like Mario here. And so we wanted to share those findings and to get a bit deeper into it. You know, the situation for civil society has changed a lot in the last few years. And we think that things have changed and the research maybe is slow to reflect that. Mario is going to update us with some of his research, but we want to, with his more recent research, but we want to hear from Christine on how the PAL network is addressing these issues of civic space, and also from Zehra on what's going on with respect to the role of civil society in national education policy spaces in Pakistan, elsewhere in the Global South. And to hear also from Tanvir about the role of donors in supporting, maybe creating space, carving out space for civil society. Specifically, I think there were 4 areas really we wanted to discuss today. The role of social movements in knowledge making. Social movements and civil society and NGOs have done a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of efforts to understand the space, the policy space in which they're working. So what do we know about that? We want to understand about South-South partnerships of CSOs in promoting learning outcomes or improving the quality of education. We've heard a lot recently about the learning crisis, but actually our research, our literature review found that the evidence about the role that civil society was playing in improving learning outcomes was a little bit thinner than we would like. We want to understand more about transnational support for national education coalitions. What's going on with that? How is that going? Is that as strong as it might be? Is it as effective as it might be? And we also want to learn about the experience of grassroots organizing in shrinking civic spaces. So I'm going to first of all hand over to Abrehet, who's going to have about 10 minutes to talk about her research. Now, Abrehet has been in her career an independent M&E consultant with a specialization in evaluation of education projects, in particular youth projects as well. But she is now doing her PhD at the School of International Service at American University in Washington, D.C., and very much a stalwart member of the Accountability Research Center at American University. And is doing some really fascinating research in her own right on youth political engagement and donor support to education and civil society. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Abrehet, for your 10-ish minutes, starting now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, and thank you all for joining. Great to have so many folks, and really appreciate everyone introducing themselves also in the chat. That's wonderful. So as Naomi said, I'm going to very briefly, perhaps about 8 or 10 minutes, speak about the work that we've been doing at the Accountability Research Center as part of the Global Learning Partnership for Education Out Loud, and specifically focused on the role of civil society in national education policy in the Global South. So really trying to uplift and trying to share the findings that we have been able to uncover and unpack in our literature review and comparative analysis. So very briefly, just to kind of set the scene for everyone, we found that overall, both in the scholarly literature as well as in the grassroots literature, there is quite limited comparative analysis on the role of civil society organizations in education advocacy. The quite notable exception is, of course, our fellow panelist here, Mario Novelli, and his work with Antonio Verger on CSOs, and I think he'll speak about that in a few minutes. But there is such a diversity of actors, particularly non-state actors, engaged in education, whether those be national education coalitions, which we have, I know, quite a few here joining us today, social movement, teachers unions, but also those that are oftentimes not well acknowledged or understood, such as parent-teacher associations or local service groups that are engaging in education advocacy, both at the grassroots level, at the local level, but also at the national level in terms of the promotion of education access for all. And our research has found that education advocacy is very prominent in regards to the expansion of education, particularly around gender. So for adolescent girls, for example, or around inclusive education for those young people with differing abilities, enabling them to be able to access public education and ensuring that it's well suited towards their needs. However, the landscape, or essentially the environment that CSOs are working with, is certainly changing. So for instance, we found that there is an emergence of perhaps a new kid in town, particularly those non-traditional civil society organizations that we may consider right-wing or corporate-backed and may not share the typical progressive agendas around basic education for all or inclusive education that more quote-unquote traditional CSOs have been operating in. We've also found that perhaps the most important role of CSOs in education thus far has been around the consolidation of education access as a norm. So I think particularly for those of us who work in comparative education in the Global South, it may be difficult or hard for us to step back a bit and realize that it is quite unique that there is such a consolidated, ironclad education norm in terms of accessing public education that may not necessarily be present in fields such as health or in food security. And civil society has really played an outsized role in advocating and forging that global norm. And we found that this is very much supported not just at the national level, but through transnational and regional networks as well. They've been supported by global education commitments, such as the Global Campaign for Education. So Tanvir will speak about supporting civil society engagement and creating a space at the table oftentimes through differing mechanisms to ensure that CSOs aren't included in education advocacy and are included in education planning. However, there are, of course, limitations to this. So particularly around civil society's participation in regards to financing or ensuring that public sector expenditure matches what was planned or what was promised in government budgets oftentimes undermines the abilities of CSOs holding governments to account. So we found that civil society organizations are typically very present in education policy or planning, but may not necessarily be able to advocate at the same level in regards to implementation or monitoring. We also find that civil society, which was very much forged or become influential in education policy during the post-Cold War trend of democratization, so being able to essentially advocate for education and for other broad human rights in the 1990s and 2000s were very much supported by transnational networks, such as the Global Campaign for Education based out of South Africa, or regional networks such as CLADE in Latin America or ANSEFA in Africa. However, I think as we all know that time period has very much ended for many civil society organizations who are oftentimes struggling with a backsliding of democratization or a shrinking civic space to advocate. So particularly as I mentioned, this norm around advocating for basic education for all has not necessarily translated for advocating for learning outcomes or for quality education. We found that CSOs have struggled both in terms of their tactics as well as their effectiveness of their advocacy in the promotion of a norm of quality education or learning outcomes. And this advocating oftentimes hinges on evolving tactics, whether that be moving from a conciliatory approach or perhaps to a more confrontational approach to vice versa, as well as navigating this really fast-moving or perhaps changing relationship with the state. So I won't spend too much more time because I'd like to give some space to our other panelists, but I also like to highlight some of the research that we've produced in these past year and a half, 2 years on the role of civil society in education. So we have quite an in-depth literature review and annotated bibliography on the role of civil society and advocacy, but a much briefer document about 6 or 7 pages that highlights the key findings, but also notes takeaways for both CSOs engaged in the work, but also funders or donors who may be interested in expanding their support for civil society organizations, as well as the work of our colleague, Dr. Felipe Evia, that Naomi mentioned around education accountability more broadly. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Abrehet. Thank you. You're incredibly brief there. And I do apologize for my dog. Sorry about that. That was a bit too exciting. And also apologies about the transcription. I'm not sure that we were able to get the closed captions to work in a sensible way. Karen, if you have any luck with that, we will put those on. But right now it's not working very well, I'm afraid to say. Thank you, Abrehet. That was a very nifty summary of the work we did. And I think one of the things that I've been emphasizing from the findings of our work has been this establishment of this norm of education for all. And I think it's one of those interesting things that many of us are involved with civil society and social movements. And because we're part of it, it becomes very hard to see our achievements. And it's one of those interesting issues that it's really important sometimes to step back and hear from the outside, to reflect from the outside the successes or the failures indeed of our activities. And so my mic seems to be weak. Is that right? Is that right? Is that better now? Zoom was asking me questions. It's still not better. Oh. I don't really know what to do about that. I'm sorry. We are now going to move on. Thank you. We're going to move on now, and I'm going to ask Mario to give us his thoughts. Mario, we're very pleased to have Mario. We've been reading his work. Abrehet and I have been reading his work quite closely over the last year and a half. And it's very exciting to meet him, albeit virtually still. Mario Novelli is professor in the political economy of education at the University of Sussex. He's a member and former director of the Centre for International Education there. And he's done a huge amount of work on issues directly relevant to our interests that we're discussing today. And his recent work, though, has focused on issues related to the role of education in peace-building processes. He's worked with UNICEF on a series of research projects since 2010, but also published some very interesting studies on the roles of social movements in relation to education policy making that we would really like to hear from him about. So I'm handing over to you now, Mario. Please take us through some of your thoughts on these very interesting issues.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. Okay, and can you see the slide that I put up?
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay, so first up, what I would like to say is just a big thank you really to Abrehet, Felipe, and Naomi for inviting me in last year to review some of the initial phases of the literature review and to also comment on the final draft. I really want to commend them on the work that they've done, put together. I think that sometimes we forget how much information is already out there and how important it is to bring together synthesis of other people's work and let it speak to each other. And so I really want to say that. Secondly, I think what I wanted to do is, in a sense, to locate myself a bit where I'm coming from. So I've put up a slide there with 2 books. The first one was published in 2012, but it really looked at movements, national coalitions that emerged out of the global campaign for education, which emerged in the late 1990s, early 2000s, out of the Education for All movement, the follow-up to John Tien in Dakar, and started to push the argument that civil society movements needed to be engaged in advocacy for education in order to ensure that the EFA targets were achieved. So it was really about movements within civil society supporting education, or movements for education. And the second book, which I'm a lead author on, that's just come out in Pluto Press, which really looks at education in movements. And those movements are from Turkey, Nepal, South Africa, and Colombia, all contexts of conflict, where movements are often under the cosh of oppressive state regimes. And really the book is about education in movements. So how do social movements learn, build knowledge, and what's the effect of that knowledge making on societies, individuals, and the movements themselves? And I think that journey from looking at the global campaign for education to looking at alternative radical social movements is something that I think is about the temporality of the changes in civil society movements. Before I move on, I just want to say that I've put links there, which after my talk, I'll copy and paste into the chat. Both of those books are open access, freely available. I'm not trying to raise money, just thought that people might be interested in learning something around those two pieces of work. So if I now try to move on to the next slide, I just want to raise really 4 questions that hopefully we could discuss through the panel and in the questions at the end that might help us to reflect on some of these issues that have come up and have come up in the excellent report as well. So I think the first one is this question of how has time, thinking about the 1990s, late 1990s to the current time, how has it changed our thinking about the education, civil society relationship? And I think that, you know, in thinking about that, we need to contextualize that a little bit more and think that in the late 1990s, we were, on the one hand, emerging out of structural adjustment and a real pressure on international organizations to be less top-down, less dogmatic in their policies towards education. It was also a moment after the Cold War had ended, where we talked a lot about democracy promotion and the role of civil society in supporting transformations, the importance of democracy therein. So in a sense, civil society had a mandate coming from the strongest powers in society. In a sense, the global hegemon, United States and its allies in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think in 2024, we're in a very different space. We're seeing, for some, the end of the US empire, at least it's weakening, the rise of China, a shift to multipolarism, I think a clear decoupling of the relationship between capitalism and democracy, which we were always told were linked closely together, rising authoritarianism. And so the context within which the global campaign was born in the late 1990s, early 2000s, has, I think, changed really radically. And I think that has implications for how to understand civil society education relationship. The second question, what is civil society and how does our framing shape our understanding? I think this is important too, because we sometimes romanticize, I think, too much the space of civil society. And I think the report itself does a good job of showing the varieties of NGOs, civil society organizations. And, you know, often we ask this question about, you know, is civil society a kind of third space between the market and the state? Is it part of this kind of bourgeois society? Is it the private sector? Is it a radical site or a conservative site? Is it a bourgeois site of accumulation? And the same goes for NGOs. You know, are they radical, transformatory, progressive organizations? Or are they, as some would argue, the midwives of neoliberalism? As the state rolled back, NGOs often filled the gaps. They've provided the possibility for the withdrawal of the state from its responsibilities. And of course, you know, some of the history of the Global Campaign for Education, and particularly ActionAid, role in this, in a sense, emerged out of that self-critique of ActionAid, that at one point it was creating alternative education schools, and then it realized that by doing that, it was letting the state off its responsibilities, and then changed policies and argued that we needed to fight for public education within national education systems. So I think that some framing of civil society is important. And I always remember this piece by Cox, an international relations author, which he wrote in 1999, called Civil Society at the Turn of the Millennium, where he talked a little bit using a Gramscian framework of kind of bottom up and top down civil society, and basically argued that civil society was a space of contestation, and social movements, NGOs, were scattered around, being pushed and pulled by different organizations and powers at different times, pushed from below by radical organizations, but also pushed from above by international financial organizations, etc. And I think that charting the relationship between different NGOs and organizations, different civil society, and kind of plotting them around some of those axes, I think is helpful. Third question, what do we mean when we talk about education and civil society? And I think, again, this comes out in the report as well. I imagine when GPE commissioned this report on civil society and education, they probably expected it to largely focus on the Global Campaign for Education and the national coalitions. But actually, if you look at the report, it explores a whole range of different issues, from the rise of for-profit institutions, the rise of pro-market NGOs supporting private education. It looks at the contentious role of student movements and trade unions, and a whole range of different actors that are involved in this process of, or involved in this relationship between education and civil society. And the reason that I think that this is important is that we often allow ourselves and our research to be driven by donor agendas. They often shape the questions that we ask and the way that we look at things. And I think it's important to open up those discussions and think about this education and civil society relationship much more broadly. And I guess that goes really to my final reflection around the importance of education with civil society, and thinking and trying to understand that more clearly. And I think that what we need to do is to open up not only the question of what is civil society to scrutiny, but also to open up education to that similar scrutiny and reflect a little bit on why education matters so much to revolutionary organizations, to social movements, to civil society, to states, and open up the definition beyond schooling and think a little bit more around alternative ways that we might think about education beyond the school and not just focus on state schooling. And I think this is particularly important in a period of authoritarianism where curriculums are closing down in universities, in schools. I was in Miami a few weeks ago where the whole education system is subject to very serious and heavy censorship of what teachers are able to talk about. And I think that leads to reflecting on the role of popular education, alternative forms of education within social movements and within communities that is outside of the formal schooling system. So I think that perhaps, thinking about the role of Paulo Freire and popular education in Brazil, that type of education became very important during the period of military dictatorships across Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, because it was an education that social movements could control and regulate and develop their own alternative pedagogies. And I think we may be entering into another period of authoritarianism where movements have to construct their own types of education and train their members and support their members to hold on to alternative ways of understanding society and the way that society might move forward. So I hope that those initial reflections are helpful to engage in a little dialogue as we move forward.
Thank you, Mario. That's tremendous. I mean, these are really excellent questions for us to think with and work with for sure. And I think they help put more concretely some of the thoughts that Abrehet and Felipe and I have been having about these issues. And your point, especially about broadening the sense of education, particularly in a time of political disinformation, misinformation, the fact that so many young people get more of their historical and political education from TikTok than they do from anything they learn in a classroom, I think is really profoundly important. And we need to think much more sensibly about those things. But also, as you say, I think we did initially think that we would be looking at the global campaign for education and the national education coalitions, and it became very clear soon enough that this was insufficient. We needed to understand about trade unions. We needed to understand youth movements and other more contentious actors in the education space if we were genuinely going to understand in any way how policies were getting made in education systems in the global South. But thank you. These are great questions for us to think about. We have to talk some more, I think, about these issues. But right now I'd like to turn over to Christine Muna. Christine is the Senior Program Officer for Communication Advocacy at the PAL Network. And I'd be really grateful if Christine could very briefly describe the PAL Network for anyone here who doesn't know what they do. But Christine, I would really like, if you can, to pick up some of these themes that we've talked about so far and talk to us a bit about South-South partnerships of CSOs, of civil society organizations, to promote improved education outcomes and to tackle the learning crisis. As Abrehet mentioned, the major contribution of civil society advocacy to date has been around universalizing norms of access. But Christine, can you help us understand what has been unique or distinctive about South-South civil society partnerships to address the learning crisis? And in particular, from your experience in the PAL network, which have been the successes? It really has been one of the rare successes, I would say, in advocating for policies to address the quality of education issues. What explains the successes that you've had with the PAL network? If you don't mind, about 7 minutes would be great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. I think when it comes to South-South partnerships, first of all, what is unique about South-South partnerships is that countries with within Africa and Asia and the Americas have cross-cutting contextual issues. If we pick, for example, the issue of poverty, and how it has overarching effects on education, which cut across these contexts, like insufficient education funding, access and equity issues. For example, children may be marginalized, or whole areas may be marginalized because of their socioeconomic standing in society, teacher shortage, and this a myriad of issues just because of the level of poverty within a certain region such as the Global South. So you find the South-South partnerships have been key and very important in that because of these cross-cutting challenges, they are deeply motivated to create solutions that are contextualized. They are motivated to bring their resources together. They are motivated to bring their networks together because they are addressing issues that are cross-cutting. So a little bit about PAL Network. PAL Network is such a South-South partnership, and it is between 17 members. Within 15 countries, working across Africa, Asia, and the Americas to promote children's foundational learning using an approach of citizen-led assessments. So when we talk about the learning crisis, what are we talking about? And this links back to Abrehet's statement there that there has been a critical role for CSOs to discuss norms and to push norms for education for all. But now there is a question of, is this education quality education? And what are the gaps that are there? And within PAL Network, if we look at the inception of this network and this movement, around 2005, we had some mothers and fathers within India who begin to realize that within their villages, there's a learning problem where children are in school and all the data, and when they can see for themselves that children are going to school, but they're not learning, they're not absorbing the foundational literacy and numeracy skills at the right level in the lower grades. And this causes a spillover effect in terms of their capacity to absorb more complex learning skills as they continue in their education journey. And then, of course, this is another spillover effect in terms of their socioeconomic outcomes and other things. So, the question became, how do we communicate this? How do we communicate this problem that we are seeing? And this led to the creation of a citizen-led assessment, a tool that could be able to measure what is the ground reality, what is it that citizens are seeing for themselves. Yes, the children are going to school, but are they learning? Is there a way to count these children? Is there a way to say in this region, this is what we are seeing as citizens? And how can we take this data and then give it to the policymakers? And how can we sit together within dialogues to see what are the solutions that can be contextualized together with the government and other decision makers? So through the citizen-led assessments, there came more and more discussions on how can we have now data that can be compared across the countries, because we're having cross-cutting challenges. Is there a way to collect this data even on a higher level so that we can have a more regional approach, we can have a more broader cross-country approach to be able to compare our gains and our successes, to be able to create this conversation within the Global South? And this has led to the creation of common assessment tools that have been put together and created through collaboration of the PAL Network members within our countries. And this, for example, is the International Common Assessment of Numeracy that measures the competency of children in the basic math. And this particular award, if I'm to link it to what I think are some of the successes of this conversation that we've been having, that is citizen-led assessments, this particular tool has been given international recognition. This is the WISE Awards. The WISE Awards is the World Innovation Summit for Education Award. And the tool was recognized as an easy to use and scalable tool. This means that it is open access, that anybody, any CSO, any government can be able to pick this and use it. And these assessments, because they were co-created with the communities to give a community perspective, they are simple to use. They are given on a one-on-one basis with children at the household level. And at the household level, we also get the children who are in school and who are out of school, because we get them at home. And so there's an aspect of also inclusivity on which children are being assessed at the household level. And so generally, we have had citizen-led assessments conducted in over 15 countries in the Global South, reaching over 9 million children, involving over 1 million volunteers. And this is quite, quite, in my view, a model about how citizens can create space in a time when we are saying the space for civil society is shrinking. I believe that one of the successes of having the South-South partnership is that it is being able to preserve a little bit the space and expand it, so to speak, as more and more countries gain interest in using a citizen-led approach and actually use it and use this data to raise visibility on issues to do with foundational learning. So for me, I think through citizen-led assessments, the partnership within South-South Partnership and PAL network has been able to create a platform for advocacy at national, regional, and global levels. When we talk about global levels, the tool, for example, the ICANN tool, is compatible with the SDG measurement indicators under SDG 4, that is particularly SDG 411A, that measures foundational learning. So we find that through this partnership and through the citizen-led assessment, we're able to preserve a little bit the space for data on foundational learning and preserve the space for civil society to collect data on what they're seeing as the reality within their villages, within their schools, and package it and bring it to a place where it can be actioned at policy level. So maybe I can start there and then we can talk a little bit more with the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. It is really encouraging. It is really encouraging. And I think that, as you say, the fact that the South-South collaboration has been able to create that space and broaden that space for citizens to participate in assessment, I think is the really striking thing. Is there any particular aspect of it that you think explains why you have been successful? Is it just the groundedness of the tool, the fact that it really has come up through extensive testing at the local level, that at multiple local levels, that explains why it has worked?
Thank you so much. I think it's a mixture of quite a number of things. Off the top of my head, I think it is this collaboration of giving people a platform to say, look, and I think about it, when I think about these assessments, to be frank, there's a temptation to think about them as a very technical, a very scientific method. And, we have a certain perspective about assessments. But the more I interact with this work that PAL Network does, I realize, if I was not in PAL Network and someone told me to have a little bit of interest to see how my child is doing, are they able to read properly? They are now at the age of 10. Can they read this text from grade 2? And it would give me that curiosity to see, this is what my child should have accomplished by this time. So these assessments, because they're done at household level, they are generating conversations, at household level. They're generating conversations around the schools. They're generating conversations around the leadership within the village, and then upward structurally up to the policy level making. And I think in terms of that co-ownership and co-designing is the strength and sustainability of the citizen-led assessment, where we are saying you don't need to be having like a PhD or a master's or, to carry out an assessment. The question is, we want to see, are children able to read basic...
Christine, where did you go? Okay, Christine has disappeared very, very suddenly. That when she comes back, we will ask her, Ayuba, what is the name of the tool again? It was the citizen-led assessment tool.
Yeah, sorry, I was briefly.
You were turfed out. Oh, you're back now.
I do apologize. I don't know if it's a network issue. I was talking too fast, I was too excited. No. But yeah. So yeah. In conclusion, I think it's the core ownership aspect of it that brings such excitement to people. For someone to say, "Look, I'm a volunteer in a village. As long as I can read, I can help this child to read. I can do this assessment." It's not the preserve of government. It's not the preserve of who. It's me getting an opportunity to give the reality that is in my context, and also participate in the conversation on what, out of this data that we have collected, what should we do about it? How should we move the assessments to action? That conversation at different levels, I feel, has been, one of the key factors that has made it successful.
I think you've explained that really beautifully. And actually, I think there's bits of that I hadn't grasped before. So I really appreciate that. And again, a similar theme to what Mario was talking about, the way in which knowledge circulates, is created, is generated by civil society activism of various kinds, I think is really important. A very particular kind of knowledge in this case, which is a knowledge about what my child should be learning and whether they are or not. Thank you so much, Christine. I'm going to now move on to Tanvir. And Tanvir is currently the manager of Education Out Loud, which is the largest civil society education advocacy fund in the world. They have grantees across 60 countries, including Accountability Research Centre and several other people, I think, in this discussion. And he manages this from the Global Partnership for Education. But he is also himself an old civil society figure, I think, in the education space, and has a lot of experience all around the world in supporting civil society in the education space. So, Tanvir, I wanted to ask you, how would you characterize what has happened to transnational support for national education coalitions in these past few years? Are international aid donors still as keen to support national education coalitions, or indeed other kinds of civil society in the education space as they were 20 years ago? How has the nature of donor support for education civil society changed? And, obviously we want to ask you about GPE and Education Out Loud, but, you rub shoulders with other donors. So tell us about, what are the donors thinking and saying about civil society and education these days?
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Well, first of all, thanking Accountability Research Center for undertaking this study, and led by Naomi, Abrehet, and Felipe. I think it's a really excellent piece of work. And I remember when I was reading it, I was nodding countless times when all these findings were resonating deeply with me. And similarly, from the conversation from the previous speakers, Mario, when Mario was mentioning about ActionAid's transition, I was also nodding, being an old ActionAider for more than a decade. And some of the conversation and some of the transitions we have seen of as a civil society organization moving from service delivery to human rights-based approach. But briefly speaking, and I don't want to go too much into what GP is. I think many of our participants are familiar with it. But from the civil society point of view, being a multi-stakeholder partnership, GP takes a civil society role very seriously, and that's why it tries to ensure civil society participation in national education policy through this funding mechanism that I work on called Education Out Loud. So in my brief intervention, I'll try to talk about basically 3 phases of donor interest, starting from the late 90s to early 2000s, then the post-MDG era, and then from the pandemic and beyond, running to present, and hopefully through the crystal ball slightly into the future. And I must say that I was also sort of stimulated by the questions that Mario posed, which are really great questions. And at one point, it would be great to have a discussion on those. But I mean, briefly speaking, from the donor interest, which have obviously been linked with some of the global policy consensus that we have seen from 1990 in Jomtien, in 2000 in Dakar, which has also shifted the core focus on civil society beyond just being stopgap service providers, because that's how civil society was largely viewed by the donor community during the 90s and even in the early 2000s, when they would look at civil society as either promoting islands of excellence, promoting alternative learning systems for different pockets of marginalized groups. So in a way, more of a service provider. But based on the role that they have played in Jomtien and Dakar in terms of coordinating concerted civil society effort, that sort of shifted the optics of how civil society is viewed in the donor eye. And that's why the whole targeted support for national and transnational advocacy gained momentum in the early 2000s. I mean, there was this transnational program called Real World Strategy, promoted by the Dutch government, and then Commonwealth Education Fund, promoted by the British government, which provided dedicated support to civil society, not as service providers, but more of a vocal advocate at the policy table. And that helped in terms of strengthening capacity of civil society in new areas, in terms of professionalizing civic engagement and sort of bridging the role that social movements play to targeted and professional advocates who are at the national and international policy tables. And that brought in expertise in technical issues like budget advocacy, public finance, which were considered mostly technical issues in the purview of dedicated researchers or economists, and brought in civil society voices in those areas. This was also the time when donors started to look at civil society as a key player in mutual accountability scenario, when civil society would be able to play a bit of a watchdog role on how policies are translated into programs at national level and how they're reaching the target groups, especially when access was a major issue as seen in the Millennium Development Goals as well. And the strong focus on access also made sure that civil society was a loud voice in bringing issues of how to ensure access for especially marginalized groups. But that changed a bit in the Sustainable Development Goal era, as we have seen. So the focus shifted from access to quality. And that's when players like PAL Network, and really appreciated intervention from Christine about the work PAL does in terms of looking at learning outcomes and making it simple enough so that common citizens can also contribute to the learning assessment and bringing that evidence to the policy table. But that was a moment where the donor focus started to shift in terms of expecting a lot more in terms of civil society contribution to the quality arena. And when education was a standalone goal, albeit slightly reduced in scope from EFA to a lot more focus on primary and basic education, that's when the donor strategies also started to shift in terms of what they want to support and what sort of role that they expect civil society to play through aid mechanisms. And GPA has been a key player in that time, starting from 2009 until now, and hopefully into the future, in terms of making sure there is consistent support to national networks and coalitions as active players at the civil society view. And then in the pandemic and beyond pandemic, a lot of things changed in terms of the resource focus, sometimes shifting from education to other areas when there was a lot of focus on a livelihood or making sure there is distance learning systems in place. But that was also the time when civil society played a very key role in defending the investment in education, and again, demonstrating why civil society voice at the policy making is important. And I think that was sort of appreciated. But the whole tendency to pigeonhole civil society as service providers, if not just face-to-face service, but sometimes for distance learning or innovative learning, that also came into play, which was a bit of a difficult tendency. And there was also a shrinking of aid for targeted civil society advocacy beyond GPE. There were other players in the field where even key foundations who would fund cutting edge civil society advocacy, they sort of started to shift away from that and focusing in other areas, which put a lot of sort of expectation on GPE being a multi-stakeholder partnership to fund civil society advocacy, which we are trying to do as best as we can, but being also very conscious that what we can offer is quite limited to what is needed or what is demanded as we move forward. And in terms of looking at the present and into the future, what I can say is that looks like there is an evolution of engagement strategy for civil society. One key marker a couple of years back was when education advocates sort of allied with human rights advocates and started using various human rights mechanisms to ensure access, sometimes to ensure quality of education for different marginalized groups. But going forward, there is also this emerging trend that we are looking at for donors to address the climate change issue and making sure there is a climate justice aspects being addressed by civil society. So it's a time for civil society to sort of reinvent, have a greater reflection on the strategies that they have been employing so far, engage a lot more about youth communities and how they can be an active player, not just limiting it to capital-based professional advocates. And that's a challenge that we can see the civil society rising up to. And that will also ensure how the donor community keeps on supporting civil society, especially for targeted advocacy. And lastly, just to say that I think it came up even in the research that ARC did and the work that Naomi did, the whole polarization in the civic space, in the shrinking space, in the fragility and conflict scenario, it has become a lot more important to see what strategies civil society can engage to manage the risks associated with confrontational strategy. And I was in Miami as well. We had questions about when we are talking about the power of protest, how has that evolved for civil society when they're engaging with policymakers, and whether face-to-face protest still seems feasible at a moment when governments can easily shut down organizations or close down spaces where civil society could be bringing in input. So I'll just stop with, again, a question to the panel in terms of how do we move forward from here, and what this the colleagues in the audience and on the panel see civil society can do in terms of evolving engagement strategy, and what role they see aid providers play in terms of supporting that role. So back to you, Naomi.
Thank you, Tanvir. Thank you so much. It's always, I really always enjoy talking to you about these issues because you have this very encyclopedic view of what has happened, you know, from the Action Aid days to the present. And I think your periodization is actually really interesting because I hadn't really thought about the post-COVID moment as something different and distinctive. But you're absolutely right. And also, of course, the sort of the techification, the digitalization of education, and the increasing preference for, I would say, if you like, civic tech solutions, I think, to education policy advocacy issues, I think have become really important. And I think certain donors, particularly foundations, really like them, but also maybe some bilaterals as well are a little bit more seduced perhaps by the digital than perhaps is necessary, is good. But we can talk some more about those in the discussion. Thank you so much for that. I'm now going to turn to Zehra, and it's really lovely to have you here, Zehra. We have some specific questions for you as well. But before I turn to that, I just want to introduce you a little bit. This is what I got from the internet, that you are the executive director of the Society for Access to Quality Education, and you lead the Pakistan Coalition for Education as its national coordinator. So you really are, you know, a person who knows exactly what we're talking about. You've been there at the very leading edge and probably faced some of the polarization and shrinking civic space issues that we are all concerned about. And you're also, I understand, on the Global Partnership for Education Board as an alternate board member of the civil society constituency. So you're really in pole position to talk about these issues. And specifically to you, Zehra, we've been hearing a lot about how hard it is getting for social movements and for civil society actors to organize in contexts where governments are hostile to aid-funded NGOs, human rights groups, or indeed hostile to any kind of independent scrutiny or advocacy work in relation to their policies. So can you talk to us about your experiences and also your partners and other colleagues' experiences of grassroots organizing in civic spaces that are shrinking or changing? What have the impacts been of these changes in civic space? And have you had any examples? Do you know any examples where coalitions have actually organized to push back successfully, or to get around these problems? And also, and I know there's a lot of questions, but answer which ones you want. How would you assess the cost to education policy making and implementation of these restrictions on civil society in Pakistan? Over to you.
Naomi, I think that these are the questions which need hours to discuss all those things, but I'll try to, share some of the perspectives and touch upon a few things which you have raised, and they are very pertinent questions actually. And I must congratulate you that this is very important discussion, and I hope that this kind of discussions will be continued so that we can have some sort of room to think around that how we will be working together so different stakeholders can work together to expand the spaces which are shrinking nowadays. When I was hearing the colleagues, and I found that I echo most of the things they are saying, and we are almost on the same line. And I found that what do we mean by civic space? And it's a very, universal kind of a thing that the number of stakeholders, think tanks, academia, experts, and all the stakeholders are actually engaging in a democratic opportunities gaining and discussing about the public policy discourse. Now, as the democratic systems are shrinking, and the civil society is not very much engaged, not very much welcome to discuss those processes, except that during this whole democratic processes, they are just involved in the voting process. So that's after elections. We know that this is more than 70% of the world is having elections. So and most of the countries are engaging with the citizens because the political parties and the needs to get the votes, and they're talking about different issues and all those things. But once the elections are over, there is no discussion, the regular discussion and engagement on the whole thing. And then the way state is backing up from its own role and responsibilities, it is very obvious that the majority of the power is lying in the hands of few people in the society, and they are very authoritative. And they don't want to be questioned. They don't want to be engaged. Want civil society stakeholders to raise questions, to ask them about the participation, their representation in different forums. And that's why the freedom of assembly, freedom of association, expression, they are very much volatile and compromised. Coming into, and this is not happening only in our country, and we found that lots of countries are facing the same problems, same challenges. And I haven't read about this study, but I hope that these are the reflection in your study as well. What is happening? Actually, the spaces for the civil society, especially the movements, the networks, they are the platforms where all the stakeholders are coming up together, and they are holding the different forces accountable, and they are actually putting the perspective of civil society and citizens in the policy discourses. Now, with the passage of time, these shrinking spaces, they are actually imposed by lots of legal requirements. For example, in our country in 2021, there is a whole set of new laws, and that what happened that suddenly we found that whatever the registration we have, or we is just cancelled, and we need to go into the renewal process and the new process. And then we started it. We have done with that process. Most of the NGOs are still in the process. Then what happened? Then you have to go to another department and you have to get NOC, no objection certificates from them to get the foreign funding. Unless you are not getting that certification, you are not eligible, and the bank is not crediting the amount. So that's another process. And then if you are it's subnational. So if you are, it's not composing of the whole of the country. So if you are registered in one part of the country to work, you cannot do the work in the other countries. And then there is this whole scrutiny and documentation process, which delay the process. And the advocacy is something which is, if it's not happening at the right time, we know that we have lost a lot of time. So this is the question which you ask about, that what are the issues, challenges, and how this whole national education or the networks are actually performing into it. Looking into the perspective of how this whole thing is actually, I think that what we are doing at the moment, that we are trying to develop strategic alliances. We cannot go. We have to fulfill all the legal requirements and whatever the documentation is there, and to manage and to try to find our spaces. We are developing our strategic alliances with different forums, at human rights forums, women rights forums, to expand our outreach and coverage, and try to bring our voices together to raise these things. Then on the same side, we are also doing the legal advocacy. So some of the organizations, some of the platforms, we are together to file the lawsuits, again, different kind of challenges civil society are facing. Then international advocacy is one of the area where we just try to find out where we got the space, either it's a UN mechanisms, high-level policy forum, or whatever the spaces we have, and how we can actually raise our voices, that how the international community can actually help us out in terms of at the country level, that they can actually pursue the governments, that there is a need that the civil society stakeholders and the government and the other stakeholders can work together in terms of bringing changes. So these are some of, and then the digital advocacy, someone has talked about it, though there are lots of bans on some of the forums, but we are trying to use this, and we know that we are actually having a challenges of using certain words. For example, if you use political discourse in education, we can't use this because that's something, what are we talking about? Are going to siding some political parties? No, it's not like that, but it's very different sometimes to give them that kind of understanding to the people. So these are the things, I think the major cost of these kind of implications and restrictions on civil society. One is this, that the advocacy and accountability agenda is suffered and it's compromised. I remember in 97 and 98, the civil society stakeholders organizations, they are very vocal. They're talking about lots of things. Though there are very, still there was a very, the gap is wide between the civil society and the government, but they are very strong and vocal. And then this is weakening now. There is no policy innovation, because if you are not, if the policymakers and the government and the state is not linking with other stakeholders, and they are not engaging with them, and there is no open debates, free discussions on different issues, raising some critical questions, which are the basic ingredient of innovation. So that's also that undermine policy innovation. Limited stakeholder engagement, which is one of the things. It's not only that the national and provincial level, but the very small organizations who have very, in-depth knowledge of their at the grassroots level, the marginalized communities, they do have the knowledge, they do have, they know what are the solutions of their problems, but they are not able to fulfill all the legal requirements. So they are almost strike out of that whole process. then there is a ban on unions. So there is no student union, teacher union. So that's also a process, and that's in a strong democratic societies, this is very important. These are very important platforms which are engaged in lots of discussions, and then they can come up with lots of good ideas. So of course there is a threat to education access and equity. If you are not able to reach to the marginalized communities, children with disabilities, and there is a restrictions, then the whole set of agenda is not truly reflected in the process. So I stop here. I'll try to cover all those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Zehra. I mean, a lot of what you say is, of course, familiar. It's always very striking when you hear it from someone who's actually dealing with this on a day-to-day basis, and also in a strategic sense, how to combat. I'm encouraged to hear that there have been some strategic alliances between civil society actors, because something I've seen in other contexts is a degree of competition between civil society groups, sometimes not just for the funding, but also for the space. But most interesting, I think, and sadly interesting, I think, is the point you make about the loss of policy innovation. And you do kind of wonder, aren't there people sitting there in the Ministry of Education going, we're losing something really valuable and important here. What can we do about it? Are there allies in that ministry that you can work with, or are people just kind of unable to engage? It's for me, a real concern, I think. But this was very interesting. Thank you, Zehra. We are going to now, I think, open up to questions, comments in the chat. A couple of people have had to leave before the end. I guess they thought it would be an hour long. But we are going to open up to questions and comments from the audience. But also, I wondered if there are people on the panel, if anyone on the panel wanted to pick up any of the comments that others have been making, because there were some, quite interesting moments there, I thought. Anyone wants to have a go before we open up properly? And Karen, do you want us to let the audience ask their questions directly, or should they put them in the chat?
It's probably easiest to put them in the chat.
Okay, thank you. Okay. One thing I was going to say to you, Tanvir, is, it strikes me that maybe funders have not been very brave, not been very not been very risk-taking in their funding of the familiar, the usual suspects. And so, there has been, I think it's fair to say, aid donors are very nervous about teacher unions and have done comparatively little work with teacher unions. That would be one thing. The other thing I would say is that, what we're seeing, I think, in our work, and I've noticed this a lot in Bangladesh, where we're doing some more work now, is that there's been a real rise in civil society actors who come from the pro-privatization, if you like, agenda, and advocating for improvements in quality of education through essentially backdoor routes to privatization one way or another. And I wondered if you wanted to comment on those sorts of issues a little bit, or anyone else wants to comment on those issues.
I mean, I'm happy to have a go first, and I know that Zehra has her hand up, and she has a lot of experience in this area. So, in terms of the risk averseness, as you have mentioned about donors, that's an interesting point, because when I was in civil society, I had one view, and then when I moved to the sort of the donor side of the table, and I got a bit more insights into how those mechanics works. So, in terms of risk awareness, what I have noticed is that obviously funders are concerned with whether the fund is being utilized properly, and also lots of due diligence processes, whether those are being implemented in proper accounting systems and all. That's one sort of a narrow operational concern. But the broader concern from the donors has also been, and I think it relates to the question I see that Kobia has asked about value for money. So I'll just try to sort of loop that one in as well, that okay, and especially it's even harder when you're in education sector, when you can fund, let's say, education provider NGOs who can build school, bring children to school and whatever, and have very concrete, tangible numbers to report vis-a-vis policy engagement, policy advocacy pieces, which are not always exact sciences and which are not always quantifiable or directly attributable to the funding that you have sort of made available. So these things make funders a bit sort of hesitant in terms of coming into this money, especially when funders also have to account for those funding to either their governments or individual funders if these are foundations. So that makes donors a bit risk averse. And the third piece is obviously operating in fragile and conflict affected context where there can be challenges of just bodily harm. I mean, when I remember when we were working with colleagues from Afghanistan or let's say Sudan, and in Sudan, the coalition office got bombed, so to speak. So how do you balance those very real risks without, being responsible for it or feeling guilty about it that, okay, you're not supposed to do no harm. That's one of the sort of underlining principle that the donors would like to have. So, so in short, it's basically a challenging issue for the donors just to say what to fund. But I think we try to be as vocal as possible in terms of documenting as much as we can from the partners that we support, that the work that they're doing. And I think we have put it down to some science, and I think the research that you have done, Naomi and Abrehet as well, it also points to some of those importance and new ways of sort of documenting and making the case for funding this very important area of civic advocacy. So I'll just stop here.
Great, thanks. Zehra, you wanted to come in on this one. Or was it something else?
I have something else, but I just want to respond to this question as well. I think that that's also important for the donor community to understand the challenges. And I found on this side as civil society that sometimes these are not very understandable, that what challenges civil society is facing. In terms of, as some of the colleagues said, value for money, in terms of this value for money, they are asking and they are continuously looking for the tangible results of advocacy within a year or two, which is not possible. We know that even the countries like us, we have spent 75 years here, and now we are not still struggling with lots of things. That how you can see that the civil society with lots of challenges, shrinking spaces, and they can produce something very, fancy thing within the year or two. So, and then the project-wise approach, right? The advocacy cannot be work like a 1 or 2 year project-wise approach. It's a long-term process. So that's the kind of thing that we need to think around, that what needs to be done in that process. Then the other thing is, one more important thing is the tokenistic approach towards the civil society organizations. The in terms of this whole inclusion participatory agenda, the most of the governments are including the civil society in terms of planning, but when they're talking about the budget, when they're talking about the finance, that's the whole complete, shut down the things. And they're not, even the donors are not raising that why the civil society is not here. We are putting money into this bucket and they are not here to raise the question. So the donor community is not very much, interesting in listening all those things. So these are the things which I must add to what Tanvir has said. And I think these are, if you give me permission, I just have 1 or 2 things which I would raise here with this. I think one of the things is we just need to now is the time to unpack or revisit the definition of civil society. That's important now. We just find it out that lots of stakeholders are coming up. Mario was talking about for-profit organizations, NGOs. I know because I'm working in Pakistan, and I know in lots of countries when NGOs, not-for-profit organizations are having so many challenges and they are not able to survive. So the other option they have, that they have like consultancy firm or they have some kind of a partnership firm where they are trying to bring the money and do the thing. So that's another alternate models. They are just adapting to it. Whether it's good or not, that's another debate to look into it. But that is there. And then there is another thing which is involved. It's for profit commercial enterprises who are coming into the process. That's another entity which is looking into the thing that hold the commercialization, privatization, along with the for-profit commercial entities which are coming into this whole process, social factor. And this also question that Maria talked about the opening discussion beyond schools. I just did the example here that Pakistan is a country where more than 26 million children are out of school. So we are now number one in the world. And the children who are going to schools, the learning poverty is 70% of the learning poverty. In that scenario, I think there is a need to open this discussion that whether it's a good thing to go beyond schools or we need to do something. Then the whole discussion about the skills, the critical skills, the skills to understand, the skills to make decisions. These are some of the things which needs to discuss in those, civic spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Zehra. I see there's an interesting question here from Chris Milora to Mario and to others in the panel about how knowledge is produced through activism movements taken up, whether it's taken up or ignored or challenged by power holders. I don't know if you would like to pick that up. I think probably both Christine and Mario would have something to comment on this.
Yeah, I can kind of link a little from the previous discussion. When we have this question of what is the definition of civil society, I think that we maybe need to ask the question of kind of acceptable and unacceptable faces of civil society now. And often I feel like the International Donor Organization wants civil society to perform the roles that it deems necessary from its perspective. Monitoring budgets, ensuring access, the things that it's signed up to. And it's less interested in supporting those movements that perhaps have different world visions of the future of education. Trade unions, student movements. And maybe we should recognize that some of those unacceptable faces of civil society are actually those that are most likely to transform education systems. So let's look at Colombia, let's look at Chile, let's look at Brazil, and ask the question of the role of those unacceptable faces of civil society, like the landless movement that organizes occupations and now runs thousands of schools across the country. Let's look at Chile and the Penguin movement, which is cited in the report, that came from students occupying schools. Later, they graduated and occupied universities, and later they occupied the state and are now in control of that government. And they're pushing through and rolling back many of the quite elitist and highly unequal neoliberal policies pushed through by the Pinochet regime, and they're trying now to unroll them. And I can talk similarly about Colombia and the Pacto Histórico that came to power a year ago. There is a coalition of social movements, including those that work on education, that's similarly trying to push for free higher education now and transform some of those things. So I guess on the issue of knowledge making in social movements, it's many of those unacceptable faces of civil society that have the most interesting ideas. They're coming out of highly unequal, contested societies, people who have struggled and fought for social justice, who are having new ideas. If we keep reproducing the ideas of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and Western donors, we'll reproduce the highly unequal world which we exist in. So I think that we should think more about, well, actually, Kaneez mentioned this. How do you build these cross-social movement alliances that can work together? And that's particularly important in these periods of authoritarianism, when being alone, you're very vulnerable. So setting up networks of solidarity and coalitions is really important to fight for that civic space. So in a sense, we're in a period of rollback of many democratic rights, But I would say this, that when we did the initial research in 2012, looking back at social movements or civil society coalitions, the strongest movements were in Brazil and in the Philippines, and they came out of resistance to dictatorships.
Yeah.
So authoritarianism doesn't necessarily just breed defeat. It can also build solidarities. So there is a phrase in Latin America for your closest friend. It's called mi llave, my key. And it comes from the Chilean dictatorship, where people used to share keys because they were being chased by state forces. But it just shows you how close the relations were between civil society organizations and social movements when they're under pressure. So I think that can also be something that we could see as a positive, that people can get together in times of pressure.
That's encouraging, Mario. And I do want to give Abrehet a chance to come into this part of the conversation, because she has a lot to say about youth movements, among other things. But I also wanted to ask you, Christine, about this point that Chris had made about troublemakers, and extent to which your knowledge is acceptable, as in Mario's term. And I think this is also, I was thinking about the PAL network and how you are a different kind of civil society group. I find it hard to make sense really of what you do, and that also speaks, I think, a bit to Anuj Chetri's point about redefining civil society in the global context. So let's hear a bit from you. When you make knowledge, the knowledge that you make in the PAL network, when does it become acceptable? When is it troublemaking? And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. Yeah, so this knowledge making, maybe from a citizen's perspective, is not always positively taken, because it's controversial when you ask a question like, the child is in school, but are they learning? The response to that is a difficult response. It causes a lot of introspection in terms of policies, in terms of teachers' levels, parental level. It's a very potent question that we are trying to pose, but it's a necessary question. And we have found more and more that trying to navigate those dialogues, between government and, just being able to state the fact and say, look, this is our lived reality here. And we can discuss a little bit more about the technicalities of how, for example, we collect this data. For example, I mentioned earlier that our tools are aligned with certain like UN frameworks, such as SDG 411A indicator. Which, in fact, there is an ongoing conversation. The SDG 411A indicator is the only indicator out of 169 indicators that measures foundational learning, and it is at risk for being removed from the UN framework. So we are having a lot of cross communications and discussions on this space around foundational learning at the government level, at these frameworks level, for example, and with the issue with the 411A indicator that is at risk, and other discussions that are happening. They're not easy to have, but they must be had. We must maintain that space. We must be able to give people space to share their lived realities. And it does not have to be confrontational. It can be dialogue, which is the most appropriate way, but sometimes this feedback and these difficult questions are not taken very positively, and which is, I guess, to some level, the point of advocacy. It has to make people uncomfortable at some point, so that you can have difficult conversations. So I think this is my perspective. Is this knowledge always taken positively? Not really. Is there some responsibility on our end to make sure that our tools and our data is quality? Yes, there is. Is there room for dialogue? Yes, there is. But at the end of the day, when it boils down to what we are talking about, it's about learning outcomes. And sometimes we should go, not sometimes, we should go beyond this terminology to see the children, and their futures. Because for us at PAL Network, we say the foundational learning is the foundation for lifelong learning. it really touches on so many educational, socioeconomic, and other things later on in life. And so we need to measure it so that we can improve it. So this is a discussion that we must maintain the space for with different stakeholders. It's not easy, but we must do it, especially for this generation and the next generations.
Well, you know, fingers crossed, inshallah, you'll be able to do that. Abrehet, I wanted to bring you in here and ask you a bit about this point that Mario made, and I think that Christine has backed up so nicely, which is that, you know, it can be challenging, and sometimes the best policy ideas, the best advocacy ideas are coming from actors that, you know, may not always be, you know, very palatable to policymakers, may not be expected. You know, what are we learning about where we should be looking for the good advocacy ideas or responding to, you know, movements that come up with ideas?
Certainly, and I think we can really think about civil society organizations like movements and unions has been discussed as really strategic thinkers in terms of navigating oftentimes such authoritarian or restricted spaces. So for instance, most recently working with coalitions and teachers unions in Zimbabwe and speaking with them about how they determine whether or not they confront the state directly, particularly in such an authoritarian context, or if they actually use certain tactics that may sort of subvert or create alternative spaces. For example, choosing teachers unions that do choose to engage in the National Education Coalition as a quote unquote critical friend of the government, while others that are very adamant about maintaining their independence and their sort of separatedness away from those perhaps co-opted or subsumed or untrustworthy partners, so as to ensure that they're able to advocate for alternative visions of what education should look like, particularly beyond perhaps traditional schooling, but more emphasis on learning. And I think this understanding of movements, unions are oftentimes couched as concerned perhaps only for their members, concerned around issues of remuneration or services of conditions of service, but in fact, they are those frontline knowledge producers, frontline knowledge midwives that are able to disseminate the values and the ethos of what constitutes education for all in their community, and are oftentimes blocked as a result. We see, for example, in the history of Ethiopia and in the work against in the 1970s and 80s, the tapping down of secondary school teachers to ensure that they're not able to promote alternative visions. So I think what we've done here today, which has been wonderful, is really to expand our understanding of what constitutes civil society, what type of advocacy that they're engaged in, and how they cope creatively and really impressively in such harsh conditions.
Well, you had just wrapped that up so perfectly. I don't need to do anything. I did just want to point out one link that Hannah Frisch has put in the chat, which is a call for evidence from the UK's FCDO's International Development Committee. They want to know what we think about civil society and their work with civil society. So we should people should try and send in their thoughts on that, their responses to that. And there are some other really interesting points in the chat. I'm afraid we don't have time to go into them now. I have time to say thank you very much to Karen for organizing us, and she's just told us that the recording will be available, to Education Out Loud for supporting our work and being always available for interesting conversations. We really like that. To all of the people who've come to talk to us today, I'm really sorry that we didn't have the French captions sorted out. I don't really know. I'm really not techie enough to give an explanation for that. I really apologize. Next time we'll do better. And thank you so much to Zehra, Christine, Mario, Tanvir, Abrehet. Thank you. That was really interesting. Really appreciate it. Look forward to more conversations.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you so
Wow.
much.